Somewhere in occupied France, 1943, a resistance cell receives word of a supply drop. They gather in a remote field at midnight, watching the sky. The sound of a distant aircraft grows louder, then fades. Parachutes blossom in the moonlight, carrying crates that thud into the soft earth. The resistance rush forward, expecting weapons, ammunition, explosives. What they find instead seems like a cruel joke. Inside the crates are thousands of small cardboard boxes, each containing what looks like a child's toy pistol made of stamped metal. The instructions are a comic strip with no words, showing a stick figure loading a single cartridge, pointing the crude weapon at a German soldier's back, pulling the trigger, then taking the dead soldier's rifle. The message is clear: this is not a weapon to fight with. This is a weapon to get a weapon. The FP-45 Liberator pistol was designed with a specific, almost cynical purpose. It would be airdropped by the millions into occupied territories across Europe and Asia. Local resistance fighters would retrieve them, use them to kill isolated enemy soldiers at point-blank range, take those soldiers proper weapons, and begin armed resistance. The Liberator was meant to be a starter weapon, a tool to begin the process of armed insurrection. It was designed to cost almost nothing, to be manufactured in enormous quantities, to require no training, and to be used once and discarded. It was possibly the most disposable lethal weapon ever created by a modern military. The concept originated in mid-1942 within the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency. OSS planners understood that successful resistance movements in occupied territories required weapons, but conventional arms drops were problematic. Dropping rifles and submachine guns required large aircraft, created significant logistics challenges, and provided weapons that could be used against Allied forces if captured by the enemy. What if instead the Allies could provide a weapon so crude and limited that it was useless to enemy forces, but sufficient for resistance fighters to begin acquiring better weapons? The weapon would need to cost almost nothing, allowing production in the millions without straining war budgets. It would need to be simple enough to manufacture using existing American industrial capacity without diverting resources from critical weapons production. It would need to require absolutely no training to use, because resistance fighters would have no access to formal instruction. And it would need to be just lethal enough to kill at the ranges where resistance fighters could realistically engage isolated enemy soldiers, which meant extremely close range, measured in feet, not yards. The design specifications were presented to American firearms manufacturers. Most declined, considering the project either impossible or beneath their capabilities. The General Motors Guide Lamp division, which normally manufactured automotive lighting, agreed to take on the contract. Their engineers approached the problem not as gunsmiths, but as industrial designers creating a disposable product. The pistol would be made entirely of stamped steel parts that could be produced on presses at high speed. There would be no machining, no precision fitting, no quality control beyond basic function testing. The weapon needed to fire one shot without exploding in the user's hand. Any additional quality or durability was unnecessary and wasteful. The design that emerged was revolutionary in its crudeness. 23 parts total, 11 of which were in the trigger mechanism. The barrel was a smooth-bore tube, unrifled because rifling would require machining. The frame was stamped sheet steel, spot-welded together. The firing pin was a simple rod driven by a coil spring. The trigger was a bent piece of metal. The grip was hollow, serving double duty as storage for spare cartridges. The entire weapon could be assembled by unskilled workers in 11 seconds. This was not hyperbole. Time studies at the Guide Lamp factory demonstrated that workers with minimal training could assemble Liberators faster than most people could tie their shoes. The cartridge was 45 ACP, a powerful pistol round that was widely available and in mass production for the M1911 pistol and Thompson submachine gun. The Liberator held 1 round in the chamber. 4 additional rounds could be stored in the grip, though reloading required manually extracting the spent case with a wooden dowel provided with the weapon, then manually loading the next round. The effective range was approximately 25 feet, and accuracy beyond arm's length was essentially random. This was acceptable because the weapon was designed for contact range assassination. The user would approach an enemy soldier from behind, place the barrel against the back of the soldier's head or body, and pull the trigger. At that range, even an unrifled barrel firing a .45 caliber bullet would be instantly lethal. After the killing, the resistance fighter would take the dead soldier's rifle, ammunition, and equipment. The Liberator would be discarded or saved for another fighter to use in the same way. This was the theory. The reality would prove more complicated. The production contract specified 1 million units at a cost of $2.10 each, including packaging and comic strip instructions. This remains one of the lowest per-unit costs for any firearm ever manufactured by a modern industrial nation. The price was achieved through ruthless elimination of anything unnecessary. The barrel was a simple tube, stamped from sheet steel and spot-welded to the frame. No rifling meant no accuracy beyond a few feet, but rifling would have required specialized equipment and added cost. The smooth bore was adequate for the intended use. The sights were minimal, just a crude front post and rear notch stamped into the frame. They were essentially decorative, given the weapon's accuracy limitations. The trigger mechanism was as simple as physics allowed. Pulling the trigger rotated a cam that compressed a spring. When the cam released, the spring drove the firing pin forward to strike the primer of the chambered cartridge. There was no safety mechanism beyond the stiff trigger pull. The weapon was either loaded and ready to fire or unloaded. Users were instructed by the comic strip manual to carry the weapon unloaded and to load it only immediately before use. The manufacturing process was optimized for speed rather than quality. Steel sheets were fed into progressive dies that stamped out all the parts needed for one complete weapon. The parts were spot welded together by workers on an assembly line. Each worker performed 1 or 2 operations before passing the partially completed weapon to the next station. The final station was function testing. Each weapon was loaded with a live round and fired once into a sand trap. If it fired without exploding, it passed inspection. If it failed to fire or if any component broke, it was scrapped and the parts recycled. The acceptance rate was approximately 95%, meaning that 5% of manufactured weapons failed basic function testing. This was considered acceptable given the low cost and intended disposable use. The Guide Lamp Division factory in Anderson, Indiana, produced Liberators at a peak rate of approximately 3,000 per day. The entire production run of 1 million units was completed between June and August 1943, a period of just 11 weeks. This remains one of the fastest large-scale weapons production programs in history, made possible only by the weapon's extreme simplicity. Packaging was equally minimalist. Each Liberator was packed in a cardboard box along with 10 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition and a wooden dowel for extracting spent cases. The instructions were a single sheet of paper printed with cartoon-style illustrations showing how to load, fire, and reload the weapon. No text was used, allowing the same instructions to be understood regardless of the user's language. The illustrations showed a resistance fighter loading the weapon, sneaking up behind a German soldier, shooting him in the back, taking his rifle, and walking away. The message was unambiguous and somewhat shocking in its directness. This was an assassination weapon, and the instructions made no attempt to disguise that fact. The entire package weighed less than 1 pound and could be packed densely for airdropping. One standard cargo pallet could hold thousands of Liberators, allowing a single bombing run to deliver enough weapons to arm a small uprising. The technical limitations of the Liberator were severe and deliberate. The smooth-bore barrel meant that the bullet would tumble unpredictably after leaving the muzzle, making aimed fire at distances beyond a few meters essentially impossible. The crude sights were useless for anything approaching precision shooting. The heavy, creaky trigger pull required significant force, making it difficult to pull the trigger without disturbing the weapon's aim, though this was largely irrelevant given the accuracy limitations. The lack of any extraction mechanism meant that spent cases had to be manually pried out with the wooden dowel, a process that took time and left the user vulnerable. Reloading under stress was nearly impossible. The weapon was truly single-shot in any practical sense. After firing once, the user would need several seconds of relative safety to reload, and in combat situations those seconds would rarely be available. The Liberator was designed to be fired once in an ambush, and then either discarded or reserved for another carefully planned assassination. It was not a combat weapon in any conventional sense. 1 million Liberators were manufactured, packed, and prepared for distribution. Then the program encountered its first major obstacle: distribution logistics. The OSS had envisioned dropping Liberators by the millions across unoccupied Europe, but actually executing this plan proved far more difficult than anticipated. Airdrops required aircraft, flight time, and acceptance of risk that aircraft might be shot down or that drops might be intercepted by enemy forces. The weapons were so crude that captured examples would provide little intelligence value to the enemy, but if Germans or Japanese forces captured large quantities, they could potentially be used to track and identify resistance networks. More fundamentally, military planners began questioning whether the Liberator concept was sound. Resistance movements needed organization, training, intelligence, and coordination more than they needed crude pistols. Dropping thousands of assassination weapons into occupied territories without corresponding organizational support might create random acts of violence but not coordinated resistance. The OSS became increasingly reluctant to proceed with mass distribution. Some Liberators were sent to Britain for potential drops into France, but few were actually deployed. The weapons sat in warehouses while strategists debated their use. The most successful deployment of the Liberator was not in Europe, but in the Pacific Theater, specifically in the Philippines. After the Japanese occupation of the Philippines in 1942, Filipino resistance groups operated throughout the islands. The OSS arranged for Liberators to be delivered by submarine to resistance leaders. The reception was mixed. Some resistance fighters appreciated having any weapon at all, even a crude single-shot pistol. Others considered the Liberators insulting, viewing them as evidence that the Americans did not take Filipino resistance seriously enough to provide real weapons. Despite these reservations, Liberators were used in several documented cases. Filipino guerrillas used them to ambush isolated Japanese soldiers, taking their rifles and ammunition. The weapons served their intended purpose in these cases, though the overall strategic impact was minimal. More effective were conventional weapons drops that provided actual rifles, machine guns, and explosives. The Liberator functioned as intended, but did not prove to be the revolutionary tool its designers had envisioned. In Europe, very few Liberators saw actual use. Some were dropped to French resistance groups, but documentation is sparse and impact appears to have been negligible. The French resistance was already receiving better weapons from British Special Operations executive drops, including Sten submachine guns and explosives. The Liberator offered nothing that resistance fighters needed. Some weapons were sent to China for use against Japanese occupation forces. Again, documentation is limited and effectiveness appears minimal. The vast majority of manufactured Liberators never left Allied warehouses. After the war, most were destroyed as surplus. Today, surviving examples are collectible firearms, valued by historians and collectors precisely because so few saw actual use. The market value of a Liberator today can exceed $1,000, ironically making the $2 pistol worth 500 times its original cost. The primary impact of the Liberator program was not military but psychological. German intelligence became aware that the Allies were manufacturing crude assassination weapons for distribution to resistance movements. This created paranoia among occupation forces, contributing to the sense that no isolated soldier was safe, that any civilian could be an assassin. Whether this psychological impact justified the $2 million cost of the program is debatable. Some military historians argue that the Liberator program was fundamentally misconceived. Resistance movements do not begin with weapons. They begin with organization, ideology, and popular support. Providing crude pistols to unorganized civilians does not create resistance. It creates random violence that invites reprisals against civilian populations. Successful resistance movements in World War II developed through careful organization and were supplied with effective weapons only after demonstrating capability and operational security. The Liberator represented a fantasy that armed uprisings could be started simply by providing weapons to occupied populations. This fantasy overlooked the complexity of organizing and sustaining resistance against professional military occupation forces. If you are finding value in understanding the gap between weapons concepts and battlefield reality, sharing this story helps more than you know. The Liberator was a solution in search of a problem, an ingenious manufacturing achievement that addressed a strategic need that did not actually exist in the form that planners imagined. Post-war analysis by military historians and resistance movement veterans consistently reached similar conclusions about the Liberator. The concept was flawed. Resistance fighters needed training, organization, intelligence, and coordination. They needed supply networks, safe houses, communication systems, and popular support. Weapons were important but secondary to these organizational needs. When weapons were needed, resistance fighters needed reliable, effective weapons they could use in sustained combat, not crude single-shot pistols useful only for point-blank assassination. The Sten submachine gun, crude by conventional standards but vastly superior to the Liberator, became the preferred weapon for resistance forces across Europe. It could be manufactured cheaply, was reasonably reliable, provided sustained automatic fire, and used common ammunition. The Liberator offered none of these advantages. Its single-shot limitation meant that users had one chance to succeed. Failure meant death. Most resistance fighters preferred weapons that gave them a fighting chance in a firefight, not weapons that worked only in perfect ambush conditions. The comparison to other improvised resistance weapons is instructive. The British Welrod suppressed pistol was designed for assassination, like the Liberator, but it was a precision weapon that could kill silently and accurately at useful ranges. It was expensive and produced in limited quantities, issued only to trained agents. The Liberator was the opposite, a cheap, mass-produced weapon that was loud, inaccurate, and crude. The British approach proved more effective. Small numbers of quality weapons in the hands of trained operatives achieved more than theoretical millions of crude weapons distributed to untrained civilians. The Soviet approach to arming partisans emphasized dropping actual military weapons, rifles, machine guns, explosives, and mines, to organized partisan units. These weapons allowed partisans to conduct sustained operations against German forces. The American Liberator concept represented a middle ground that satisfied neither quality nor quantity requirements effectively. It was too crude to be effective and too limited in distribution to achieve mass impact. The modern legacy of the Liberator emerged unexpectedly in 2013 when a group called Defense Distributed created a 3D printable pistol and named it the Liberator, in homage to the World War II weapon. The modern Liberator shares conceptual similarities with its namesake: crude construction, single-shot design, and the idea that anyone with access to basic tools can manufacture a functional firearm. The parallels are not accidental. Both weapons represent attempts to democratize access to lethal force, though the contexts and implications differ dramatically. The original Liberator was a government program intended to arm resistance against military occupation. The modern 3D printed Liberator is a statement about the impossibility of gun control in an age of digital manufacturing. Both weapons sparked intense debate about the relationship between weapons availability and political power. The original Liberator's failure to achieve its strategic goals does not diminish its significance as an artifact of World War II era thinking about unconventional warfare. The weapon represents American industrial capacity applied to an unconventional problem. The fact that 1 million functional firearms could be designed, manufactured, and packaged in 11 weeks demonstrates manufacturing capability that is genuinely impressive regardless of the weapon's effectiveness. The Liberator also represents a certain naivety about resistance warfare, a belief that providing weapons alone could spark uprisings without corresponding investment in organization and training. This belief persisted in various forms throughout the Cold War and into modern conflicts, often with similarly disappointing results. Weapons alone do not make fighters. Training, organization, and purpose make fighters. Weapons are tools that effective fighters use, but they are not the source of fighting capability. The economic legacy of the Liberator is its demonstration that firearms could be manufactured at costs approaching those of simple consumer goods. The $2 cost per unit, adjusted for inflation to approximately $35 in modern currency, remains remarkably low for a functional lethal weapon. Modern firearms manufacturing has incorporated many lessons from the Liberator program about stamped steel construction and simplified assembly processes. The Liberator proved that weapons need not be machined from billet steel or assembled by skilled craftsmen to function adequately for their intended purpose. This democratization of manufacturing capability has had far-reaching implications for global weapons availability. In the vast catalog of World War II weapons, the FP-45 Liberator occupies a unique position as the weapon that almost started a revolution but never did. It was ingeniously designed, efficiently manufactured, and strategically irrelevant. It proved that crude weapons could be produced at enormous scale and minimal cost. But it also proved that crude weapons distributed without supporting infrastructure achieve little. The $2 pistol remains a testament to American industrial ingenuity and a cautionary tale about confusing weapons with capability. The Liberator could kill at arm's length, but it could not create the conditions that make resistance successful. That required more than even 1 million disposable pistols could provide.